In the unforgiving dust of the West, a man's worth was measured in cattle land and the cold steel on his hip. For Jedediah Stone, a man richer than a king, but poorer in spirit. His heart was a barren wasteland, locked away behind a tragedy he could never outrun. But what happens when he pays a handful of silver for the one thing he never knew he needed? Not a prize mare or a deed to more land, but a woman discarded and broken, thrown away by a worthless husband. This isn't just a story of the Wild West. It's the story of a transaction that became a transformation, a purchase that became a rescue, and how a woman with nothing left to lose healed a man who had everything to lose. Stay with us for the tale of Isabella and the stone-hearted cowboy. The town of Redemption Gulch was a liar. It promised salvation in its name, but offered only dust desperation and the kind of heat that baked the hope out of a man's soul. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the saloon, the general store, and the collection of weary souls who called this patch of dirt home. Inside the Dusty Spur saloon, the air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey sweat and despair. This was the domain of Marcus Thorne, a man whose charm was as thin as the veneer on the warped poker table where he perpetually sat. He had the slicked-back hair of a riverboat gambler and the hollow eyes of a man who'd sold his soul for one more hand. His wife Isabella stood by the far wall near the swinging doors, trying to make herself invisible. She was a ghost in a calico dress. Her beauty faded not by age, but by the constant erosion of fear and neglect. Her hands, once soft and nimble, were now rough, calloused from work that earned her no thanks. She clutched a near-empty water pitcher, waiting for Marcus's inevitable snarled command. Today the cards had been cruel. Marcus was losing, and his opponent was a hulking buffalo hunter with a temper as short as his greasy fuse. With a final disgusted flick of his wrist, Marcus threw his last 2 cards onto the table, a losing pair. The buffalo hunter grunted, sweeping the pile of coins towards him. "Looks like you're cleaned out, Thorne." Marcus's face, already pale with sweat, turned a blotchy red. Humiliation was a poison in his veins. He looked around wildly, his eyes landing on Isabella. A cruel, desperate idea began to curdle in his mind. "Not quite," Marcus slurred, a wicked grin spreading across his lips. He stood his chair, scraping loudly against the wooden floor, and pointed a trembling finger at his wife. "I've got one more thing of value." A hush fell over the saloon. Even the grizzled bartender stopped wiping his glass. Isabella's heart plummeted a cold stone in her stomach. She knew that look. It was the look he got before he did something truly unforgivable. "What in blazes are you talking about, Thorne?" the hunter growled. "Her," Marcus said, his voice rising with a mad theatricality. "My wife, a fine worker, obedient. I'll wager her against my debt, and another $50. The saloon erupted in a mixture of shocked gasps and nervous, cruel laughter. To wager a woman, your own wife, was beyond the pale, even for a place like Redemption Gulch. Isabella felt the floor drop out from beneath her. The world shrank to the leering faces around her, their eyes stripping her of the last vestiges of her dignity. She was no longer a person. She was chattel a horse, to be traded a poker chip to be bet. Her breath caught in her throat, a silent scream trapped behind her lips. The buffalo hunter looked her over, his eyes lingering with a crude appraisal. "She's a bit scrawny, but I'll take the bet." Before the cards could be dealt, the saloon doors swung open with a force that made them slam against the inner walls. The sudden flood of white-hot sunlight silhouetted a tall, broad-shouldered figure. As he stepped inside, the light revealed a man who seemed carved from the very rock of the surrounding mountains. This was Jedediah Stone. His name was whispered in places like this, a name synonymous with wealth and power. He owned the Stone Crest Ranch, a sprawling empire of cattle and land that stretched to the horizon, a place so vast it was said you could ride for 2 days and never leave his property. He was a legend, but a reclusive one. He rarely came to town, and when he did, it was for business, his face a mask of cold indifference. He wore wealth not in fancy clothes, but in the fine leather of his gun belt, the custom tooling on his saddle visible through the doors, and the chilling stillness in his grey eyes. Those eyes, people said, had seen too much sorrow and had frozen over. Jedediah's gaze swept the room, taking in the scene with a glance. He saw Marcus puffed up with his own vile proposition. He saw the brutish hunter ready to claim his prize. And then he saw Isabella. He saw the terror in her wide, doe-like brown eyes, the slight tremble of her chin she was desperately trying to control, the way she clutched the pitcher as if it were a shield. For the first time in 5 long years, since the day he buried his wife and daughter Jedediah, Stone felt something other than the dull, cold ache of loss. It was a flicker of something else, a protective anger, a spark of indignation that a human being could be treated as less than the cattle he raised. He walked forward, his spurs ringing a lonely metallic tune on the floorboards. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He stopped at the poker table, his shadow falling over the cards. He didn't look at Marcus or the hunter. His gaze was fixed on Isabella. "How much is the debt?" Jedediah's voice was low, a gravelly rumble that cut through the silence. Marcus, momentarily stunned by the presence of the formidable rancher, stammered, $100, and he was staking another 50 against her. Jedediah finally turned his cold eyes on Marcus. "So her worth to you is $150. It wasn't a question. It was a condemnation. Without breaking eye contact, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a thick leather wallet. He counted out 3 crisp $100 bills and dropped them on the table. They landed with a soft, final thud. "This is 300, Jedediah stated. 150 to clear your debt. The other 150 is for her." He wasn't wagering. He was buying. Marcus stared at the money, his greed battling the shred of pride he had left. The battle was short-lived. He snatched the bills from the table. "She's yours," he said, avoiding Isabella's horrified gaze. Jedediah turned to the buffalo hunter. "The game is over. Get out." The hunter, who would have torn Marcus limb from limb, simply looked at Jedediah Stone, at the expensive Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip, and at the absolute certainty in his eyes. He grunted, pushed his chair back, and lumbered out of the saloon without a word. The room was deathly quiet. Jedediah now looked at Isabella. Her face was ashen tears finally streaming down her cheeks, silent testament to her complete and utter devastation. She had been publicly shamed, sold by her husband, and bought by a stranger. She didn't know if she had been rescued or simply transferred from one cage to another. "Come," Jedediah said. It was not a gentle invitation. It was a command, albeit one spoken without the cruelty she was used to. She didn't move, frozen by shock and fear. He took a step closer, and for a moment she flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, he gently took the heavy water pitcher from her trembling hands and set it on a nearby table. His touch was brief, impersonal, but it was the first time in years a man had touched her without intent to harm or take. "You have nothing to fear from me," he said, his voice still low and flat. "But you are no longer his. You will come with me." He turned and walked towards the doors, not looking back, assuming she would follow. For a long moment, Isabella remained rooted to the spot. She looked at Marcus, who was already stuffing the money into his pocket, his face a mask of selfish relief. He wouldn't even look at her. In that moment, she knew that any life, even one with this cold, mysterious stranger, was better than the one she was leaving behind. With a deep, shuddering breath, she took the first step. Then another. She walked past the silent, staring patrons, her head held as high as she could manage. She walked out of the dusty Spur saloon and into the blinding sunlight, following the man who had just bought her, leaving the ghost of her old life to rot in the darkness. The ride to Stonecrest was a silent one. Jedediah rode a magnificent black stallion, and he'd procured a gentle mare for Isabella from the livery. He didn't speak, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, his posture rigid in the saddle. Isabella followed a few paces behind the dust from his horse, coating her worn dress. The landscape shifted from the squalor of Redemption Gulch to a vast, ruggedly beautiful expanse of rolling hills dotted with ancient oaks and towering rock formations that gave the ranch its name. This was a land of giants. Everything was bigger, wilder, and more profound than anything she had ever known. The ski was an endless blue canvas, and the silence was a living thing broken only by the cry of a hawk and the rhythmic clop of their horses' hooves. It was intimidating, but after the suffocating noise of the saloon, it was also a balm. As they crested a final rise, Stone Crest Ranch unfolded below them. It took Isabella's breath away. A massive two-story ranch house built of dark timber and riverstone stood proudly amidst a cluster of towering cottonwood trees. A dozen outbuildings, a huge barn, stables, a bunkhouse, a smithy were spread out around it like loyal subjects. Corrals held hundreds of horses, and in the distance she could see the dark, moving river of cattle that was the source of Jedediah Stone's immense wealth. The place was a kingdom. But as they drew closer, she noticed something odd. For all its grandeur, it felt empty. There were ranch hands moving about their faces, weathered and tough, but the house itself seemed unnervingly still. The windows were like vacant eyes. There were no flowers in the yard. No sign of a woman's touch, no laughter of children. It was a magnificent, lonely fortress. Jedediah dismounted in front of the main house and tied the reins to a hitching post. He moved with an economy of motion, all quiet competence. He helped Isabella down, his hands firm and impersonal on her waist, releasing her the moment her feet touched the ground. "Maria!" He called out, his voice echoing slightly in the vast yard. An older woman with a face like a wrinkled, kindly apple and a long grey braid down her back emerged from the house, wiping her hands on an apron. Her dark eyes were sharp and intelligent, and they took in Isabella with a quick, assessing glance that held no judgment, only curiosity. "This is Isabella," Jedediah said, his tone flat and businesslike. "She will be staying here. She will be helping you with the house. Find her a room. Give her what she needs." Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode towards the massive barn, his spurs ringing his departure. He hadn't explained who she was or why she was there. He had simply delivered her like a piece of freight. Isabella stood awkwardly, feeling small and out of place. Maria looked from Jedediah's retreating back to Isabella's anxious face. "Come, child," Maria said, her voice warm and accented. "The sun is hot, and you look like you could use a cool drink of water." Maria led her into the house. The interior was as imposing as the exterior. A huge stone fireplace dominated the main room, its hearth cold and black. The furniture was heavy and masculine, dark leather chairs, a massive oak table, and everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. The air was stale, as if the windows had been sealed for years. It was the house of a man who didn't live in it, but merely occupied it. Maria showed her to a small, simple room at the back of the house, overlooking what was once a garden, now a tangle of weeds and thorns. The room was clean but sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a small wardrobe, and a washstand. "This will be yours," Maria said gently. "It's not much, but it is safe." The word safe hung in the air between them. Isabella's eyes welled with tears. He bought me," she whispered, the shame of it still raw. Maria nodded slowly, her expression full of a deep, ancient wisdom. "I know. The hands who were in town have already brought the story back on the wind. Men can be fools, child. Some for greed, some for sorrow." Over the next few days, Isabella learned the rhythm of Stone Crest. It was a rhythm of work. She rose before the sun, helping Maria in the vast, echoing kitchen. She cleaned the silent rooms, polished the dusty furniture, and washed the heavy curtains. She worked until her body ached, finding a strange comfort in the exhaustion. It kept the memories at bay. Jedediah remained a distant, formidable presence. He ate his meals alone, served by Maria, and spoke only when necessary. He would leave before dawn and return after dusk, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical labor. Isabella would sometimes see him from a window standing alone by the corral fence, staring out at the land he owned, but seemed to take no joy in. He was a king in exile within his own kingdom. One evening, while clearing the dishes from his solitary dinner, Isabella found the courage to speak. "Mr. Stone," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up from his paperwork, his grey eyes startlingly direct. "My name is Jedediah." "Jedediah," she corrected herself. I want to thank you for what you did." His expression didn't change. "I did what was necessary. You will work for your keep. This is a transaction, nothing more." His words were cold, deliberate, meant to draw a line between them. He was not her savior. He was her proprietor. But Isabella was beginning to see past the stone wall he had built around himself. She saw it in the way he treated his horses, with a gentle hand and a quiet word. She saw it in the loyalty of his men, who grumbled about his moods but respected him utterly. And she saw it in the eyes of Maria, who watched him with a mixture of sadness and fierce maternal protection. Determined to earn her place, and perhaps to bring a sliver of life back into this desolate house, Isabella turned her attention to the dead garden outside her window. She asked Maria for tools, and the older woman provided them with a knowing smile. Day by day, Isabella toiled under the sun. She pulled weeds, turned the dry, compacted soil, and carried buckets of water from the well. It was back-breaking work, but as her hands worked the earth, she felt a piece of her own bruised spirit beginning to mend. The soil didn't judge her. The sun didn't mock her. One afternoon, as she was carefully transplanting some wild desert marigolds she'd found growing by the creek, she felt a shadow fall over her. She looked up to see Jedediah on his stallion watching her. He had approached so quietly, she hadn't heard him. He sat there for a long time, his face unreadable. He looked at the cleared patch of land, the neat rows she had begun to form, and the small, vibrant flowers. He said nothing. He just watched. Then he nudged his horse and rode away towards the open range. Isabella watched him go, a strange feeling blooming in her chest. He hadn't offered a word of praise, but he had looked. He had noticed. In the silent, lonely kingdom of Stone Crest, to be noticed by the king was a seismic event. It was the first small crack in the stone. That evening, when she came in from the garden, a small sack of vegetable seeds sat on her bedside table. There was no note. There was no explanation. But Isabella knew with absolute certainty who had put them there. Weeks bled into months. The garden behind the Stone Crest ranch house, once a testament to neglect, began to flourish under Isabella's patient care. Rows of beans, squash and corn stood tall, and the vibrant heads of the marigolds she'd transplanted now tracked the sun across the sky. The work was hard, but it was honest, and it was hers. For the first time since she was a little girl, she felt a sense of ownership over something beautiful. The garden was not the only thing changing. The house itself seemed to breathe again. Isabella insisted on opening the windows, letting the breeze chase the stale air from the rooms. She found a stash of her predecessor's linens, sewn with delicate, faded flowers, and put them on the tables. Small, simple changes, but they were like finding a pulse on a body presumed dead. Jedediah never commented on these changes, but he stopped eating his meals in stony silence in his study. He began taking them at the massive oak table in the main room. He still spoke little, but his presence was a concession, a silent acknowledgement of her efforts. The real shift came one sweltering afternoon. A commotion in the stables drew Isabella out from the kitchen. One of Jedediah's prize mares, a beautiful palomino, had gone into a difficult labor. The foal was stuck. The ranch veterinarian was a day's ride away, and the hands, for all their experience with cattle, were at a loss. The mare was in distress, her eyes wide with pain and panic. Jedediah was there, his sleeves rolled up his face, grim. He had been trying to help, but the situation was growing dire. "We're going to lose them both, boss," one of the hands said, his voice low and respectful. Isabella, who had grown up on a small farm before her father's death, had led to her ill-fated marriage, pushed her way through the circle of anxious men. "Let me see," she said, her voice calm but firm. The men looked at Jedediah, who gave a short, sharp nod. Isabella knelt by the mare, speaking to her in a low, soothing tone. She ran a hand over the horse's sweating flank, her touch surprisingly confident. "Maria, I need willow bark tea, strong and lukewarm, and clean rags," she commanded, her focus entirely on the animal. Maria, seeing the look in her eye, scurried off to the house without question. "My grandmother taught me about herbs and birthing," she explained to no one in particular. "Sometimes the old ways are best." She examined the mare with a practiced eye. "The foal is breech," she stated simply. She knew what needed to be done, a risky and difficult maneuver. When Maria returned with the tea, Isabella gently coaxed the mare to drink some of the pain-relieving liquid. Then, taking a deep breath, she began her work. She was not a scrawny, broken thing now. She was a woman of purpose and strength. Her movements were sure, her commands to the ranch hands helping her were clear. Jedediah stood back, watching in stunned silence. He saw not the woman he had bought out of a moment's pity, but a healer, a force of nature as powerful as the mare she was fighting to save. After a tense, grueling hour with a final great effort from both Isabella and the mare, a tiny wet foal slid out into the hay. It lay still for a terrifying moment before sputtering and shaking its head. The mare, exhausted but alive, immediately began to nuzzle her newborn. A collective sigh of relief went through the stable. The hands clapped Isabella on the back, their faces filled with awe and gratitude. But Isabella only had eyes for Jedediah. He walked over his boots, silent, in the hay. He looked at the mare, the healthy foal, and then at her. His face was a mixture of emotions she couldn't decipher, but the cold, impenetrable wall in his eyes had crumbled. "You saved them," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The mare, she was a gift from my wife. The last one." It was the first time he had ever mentioned her. The name of his late wife, Eleanor, was never spoken on Stonecrest. It was a sacred, painful word that had been buried with her. Later that evening, as Isabella sat on the porch, soaking her aching muscles, Jedediah came and sat in the chair beside her. For a long time they sat in a comfortable silence, listening to the crickets. "Eleanor loved this ranch," he began, his voice quiet. "She's the one who planted that garden. She filled this house with life." He paused, the word catching in his throat. "We had a daughter, Lily. She had her mother's laugh." Isabella listened, her heart aching for him. She didn't speak, knowing he needed to let the words out, that they had been trapped inside him for too long. "There was a fever." He continued, his gaze lost in the darkening horizon. "Swept through the valley 5 years ago. I was away on a cattle drive, pushing a herd up near the Chisholm Trail to get a better price. I thought I was building an empire for them." His voice cracked. "By the time I got the news and rode back, it was too late. I was burying my empire in 2 small plots on that hill over there." He pointed to a gentle slope dotted with oak trees, a place Isabella had often looked at wondering. "I'm sorry, Jedediah," she whispered. "I locked the doors, shut the windows. I let the garden die because I couldn't stand to see anything grow. It felt like a betrayal." He confessed, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I surrounded myself with silence and work, and I called it living." He finally turned to look at her, and his grey eyes were no longer cold stone, but shimmering pools of immense sorrow. "And then you came, and you opened the windows, you worked the dead soil, and you brought life back, not just to that horse, but to this place, to me." The confession hung between them, raw and powerful. The transaction was long forgotten. He was no longer her proprietor, and she was no longer his purchase. They were 2 broken people sitting in the twilight who had inadvertently found the missing pieces of their own souls in each other. Isabella reached out her hand, hesitating for a moment before she placed it gently on his arm. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. It was comfort. It was understanding. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one not written in a ledger of debt and payment, but in the shared language of a healing heart. But the world outside of Stonecrest had not forgotten the transaction, and in the dusty streets of Redemption Gulch, a venomous seed of greed and revenge was beginning to sprout. News in the West traveled on the wind carried by gossiping merchants and drifting cowhands. The story of how the reclusive Jedediah Stone had bought a saloon girl, or rather a cast-off wife, for $300 was a juicy piece of news that had circulated far and wide. Most saw it as another oddity of the rich rancher, but for one man, the story was not an oddity. It was an opportunity. Marcus Thorne had burned through Jedediah's $300 in less than a month. His luck at the card table had not improved, and his debts were mounting once more. He had been run out of 2 neighboring towns for cheating, and was now living in a squalid boarding house, his fine clothes stained and tattered. He was bitter, resentful, and his thoughts kept returning to Isabella. He didn't miss her. He had never cared for her beyond what she could do for him. What he missed was the control. And now, hearing tales of her life at the sprawling stone crest, a venomous envy gnawed at him. She who he had deemed worthless was living in luxury, while he, her rightful husband, was rotting in filth. But it was a chance conversation with a drunk, disgruntled ex-ranch hand from Stone Crest that planted the real seed of a plan in his mind. "The boss is different now." The hand slurred over a bottle of cheap rye. "Used to be. He never cracked a smile. Now he's softer. It's that woman Isabella. He watches her like a hawk watching its nest. Had the cook bake a cake for her birthday. And a cake. Jedediah Stone." Marcus's weasel-like brain went to work. So the cold-hearted rancher had developed feelings for his purchase. He hadn't just bought a housekeeper. He'd found a replacement for his dead wife. A man with feelings was a man with weaknesses. A man with weaknesses could be squeezed. His plan was simple and vile. He still held the marriage certificate. In the eyes of the law, however flimsy it was out here, Isabella was still his wife. The sale in the saloon was not a legally binding transaction. It was a shameful public spectacle, but it wouldn't stand up in front of a real circuit judge. Marcus scraped together his last few dollars, bought a lame horse, and began the long ride back to Redemption Gulch, the staging ground for his new venture. He didn't go into town. Instead, he made a camp in the hills overlooking the trail that led to Stone Crest, waiting, gathering his courage. On the ranch, the atmosphere had transformed. The tentative bond, forged between Jedediah and Isabella on the porch that night, had deepened. They spoke more freely now, sharing meals and quiet conversations. Jedediah found himself smiling a foreign and rusty action. He listened as Isabella spoke of her dreams for the garden, her knowledge of plants, her simple hopes for a peaceful life. He was falling in love, a terrifying and exhilarating realization. Isabella in turn saw the good man buried beneath years of grief. She saw his fairness with his men, his love for his land, and the gentle way he now treated her, not as an employee, but as a cherished companion. The fear she had lived with for so long had been replaced by a blossoming affection that felt safer and more real than anything she had ever known. One morning, Jedediah asked Isabella to ride with him. He wasn't going to check on cattle or fences. He took her to the hill with the 2 oak trees. 2 simple, beautifully carved wooden markers stood in the shade. Eleanor Stone, beloved wife. Lily Stone, beloved daughter. He stood beside her, not touching, but his presence was a comfort. "I wanted you to meet them," he said quietly. I think they would have liked you." Tears streamed down Isabella's face, not of sadness, but of profound gratitude. He was sharing the most sacred part of his soul with her. He was letting her into his past, showing her he was ready for a future. It was on their ride back to the ranch house that the shadow fell across their path. Marcus Thorne stepped out from behind a rock formation blocking the trail. He held a Winchester rifle, though he held it loosely, not aiming it directly at them. He looked gaunter, more desperate, and his eyes burned with a feverish intensity. "Well, well," Marcus said, his voice slick with false bravado. "If it isn't the happy couple." Jedediah's body went rigid. His hand instinctively moved to the colt on his hip. He positioned his horse slightly in front of Isabella's, shielding her. "Thorne, you have no business here." "Oh, I think I do. Marcus sneered, his eyes flicking to Isabella. She stared at him, the blood draining from her face. Seeing him again was like a bucket of ice water, bringing back all the old fear, the humiliation. You see, I've been thinking. That little deal we made in the saloon, it wasn't exactly legal, was it? In fact, this woman here, he gestured with the rifle, is still my wife, Mrs. Marcus Thorne. Jedediah's voice was dangerously low. That's a lie. You threw her away. You sold her. I was under duress. A grieving husband who'd had too much to drink, Marcus said, a mock sadness in his voice. A judge would see it my way, especially when I tell them how a rich, powerful man like you took advantage of my weakness to steal my bride. The threat was clear. It wasn't just about getting Isabella back. It was about blackmail. It was about destroying Jedediah's reputation. A man like Stone, who valued his privacy and his name, would be dragged through the mud. The story would be twisted, making him look like a predator. "What do you want, Thorne?" Jedediah asked, cutting to the heart of it. "A severance package, you might say." Marcus grinned, showing his yellowed teeth. "Compensation for my emotional distress, for the loss of my companion. $5,000. A small price to ensure my silence and my permanent departure." Isabella felt sick. He was using her again, a pawn in his disgusting games. She was the wound he was pressing on to make Jedediah bleed. "You won't get a single cent." Jedediah snarled, his rage barely contained. "No." Marcus raised the rifle slightly. "Then I'll just take back what's mine. Come on, Isabella. We're leaving." He took a step towards her. Isabella's mare, sensing her rider's terror, shied away. But something in Isabella snapped. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now mixed with a white-hot anger. She had worked so hard to build this new life to heal. She had found kindness and respect. She would not let this parasitic creature drag her back into the dark. "No," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I will not go with you. You are not my husband. You stopped being my husband the day you put me on that poker table." Marcus's grin faltered, replaced by a flash of fury. "You foolish girl. You have no say in this." "She has every say," Jedediah bit out. "This is my land. You are trespassing, and you are threatening a resident of my ranch. Get out of here, Thorne, before I forget what mercy is." Marcus hesitated, looking from Jedediah's face of cold fury to Isabella's unexpected defiance. He had expected Jedediah to negotiate, to pay. He had expected Isabella to cower in fear. This was not going according to plan. "This isn't over, Stone," he hissed, backing away slowly. "You'll hear from my lawyer. The whole territory will know what you did." With a final hateful glare, he scrambled back onto his lame horse and galloped away, a pathetic retreating figure. The silence he left behind was heavy with tension. The beautiful day had been poisoned. Jedediah turned to Isabella, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though she was trembling. "He won't stop, Jedediah. He'll do what he said. He'll try to ruin you." Jedediah looked at her, his expression softening. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. His grip was firm, steadying. "Let him try," he said, his voice a low, determined vow. "He thinks he's threatening my reputation, my money. He doesn't understand. He's threatening my home." He squeezed her hand. "He's threatening you, and I will burn the world down before I let him lay a hand on you again." The battle line had been drawn. It wasn't about a saloon deal anymore. It was about a future and a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. Marcus Thorne was a cornered rat, and in the desolate hills overlooking Stonecrest, his small, pathetic camp festered with the stench of resentment. He had no grand strategy Mualme to command. His only asset was a bottomless well of malice, and his only companion was the gnawing envy that consumed him day and night. From his vantage point, he watched the distant, orderly movements of the ranch through a pair of cheap, stolen field glasses. He saw Jedediah and Isabella riding together. He saw the smoke rising from the main house's chimney, a symbol of the warmth and comfort he had lost, and that she, in his twisted view, had stolen. He saw happiness, and he could not abide it. The knowledge that Jedediah Stone, a man of immense power and wealth, had found solace with the woman Marcus had deemed worthless, was a personal insult that burned hotter than any branding iron. His plan, therefore, was not one of profit or reclamation. It was simpler, purer in its evil. If he could not have the life they were building, he would turn it to ash. He would become a ghost in the canyons, a phantom of terror designed to methodically dismantle their peace. The campaign began subtly. A remote line cabin nestled deep in a western valley and used by hands during roundups was the first to go. A rider found it 2 days later, not a structure anymore, but a blackened, smoldering scar on the landscape. The smell of soot hung heavy in the air for miles. There was no evidence, no tracks left behind, only the chilling message, "I can touch you wherever I want." A week later, the ghost struck again. A 50-yard section of the northern pasture's barbed wire fence was expertly cut under the cover of darkness. Over 100 head of prime cattle, ready for the long drive to market, drifted out into the treacherous rocky canyons. It took Jedediah and every available hand a full, grueling week of hard riding to recover most of them. They returned exhausted, their horses lame, their nerves frayed. The financial loss was significant, but the psychological toll was greater. The vast open spaces of Stonecrest, once a symbol of freedom and prosperity, now felt like a liability. A sprawling, indefensible territory, haunted by a single, determined predator. The ranch became a fortress under siege. The easy camaraderie of the bunkhouse was replaced with suspicious glances and hushed, anxious conversations. Men began sleeping with their pistols under their pillows, starting at every coyote's howl, every rustle of wind in the cottonwoods. Jedediah was transformed into a walking storm cloud of controlled fury. He barely slept patrolling the vast property himself, his Winchester rifle becoming a permanent extension of his arm. Isabella watched the change in him with an aching heart. The lines around his eyes deepened, etched by sleeplessness and a constant, simmering rage. But beneath the anger, she saw what truly drove him a profound, desperate fear. It was not for his cattle or his fences. It was for her. Every act of sabotage was a message from Marcus, aimed directly at the heart of Jedediah's new world, and Isabella knew she was the bullseye. This knowledge forged something new and unbreakable within her. The cowering woman from the dusty Spur saloon was gone, burned away by the fires of her own resolve. She would not be the weak point in this fortress's walls. She became its anchor. While the men rode out with guns, she fought the siege with quiet competence. She organized the women on the ranch, Maria, and the wives of the handful of married hands into a formidable support system. They kept hot coffee brewing at all hours and ensured a warm meal was ready for any man returning from a long, cold patrol. Using the knowledge her grandmother had passed down, she made calming teas from chamomile and mint to soothe frayed nerves, and she prepared salves for the scrapes, burns, and rope-galled hands of the men. Her presence was a steadying one, a quiet hum of resilience that countered the rising tide of fear. One evening, as she and Maria stood on the porch, watching Jedediah lead another patrol into the deepening twilight, the older woman placed a comforting hand on her arm. "He carries the weight of this whole place on his shoulders," Maria said softly, her eyes on Jedediah's rigid back. "But you, child, you have reminded the heart of this place how to beat." Maria looked at her, her dark eyes filled with a deep, knowing respect. "He is the stone walls, but you are the fire in the hearth. Do not let that fire go out." The words resonated deep within Isabella, strengthening a part of her she never knew existed. She was not just a resident here, she was a defender. The final confrontation came on a hot, tinder-dry night at the end of a long, wind-whipped week. The air was electric with tension so dry that a single spark felt like a threat of annihilation. The wind moaned through the eaves of the house, a mournful, ominous sound. Suddenly the night was shattered by a frantic shout from the direction of the bunkhouse, followed by the frantic pounding of hooves. A young ranch hand galloped into the main yard, reining his horse to a dramatic halt. His face was a pale mask of alarm in the moonlight. "The north pasture, boss! It's on fire!" he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "The wind's carrying it fast. It's heading for the main barn." This was it, the ultimate act of destruction. The main barn was the nerve center of the ranch, housing not only the priceless breeding stock, including the Palomino mare and her foal, but also tons of dry winter hay that would fuel a blaze into an unstoppable inferno. "Get every man with a wet sack and a shovel!" Jedediah roared his command, cutting through the rising panic. He was already running towards the stables, his mind a blur of strategy and logistics. He paused only to turn back to Isabella, who stood frozen on the porch. "Isabella, get inside the house. Lock the doors. Do not open them for anyone." His order was a desperate plea to keep her safe, the one thing he cared about more than his ranch. But as he and the last of the hands thundered off towards the angry orange glow that was now visible on the horizon, Isabella's mind raced. An icy certainty settled in her stomach. This was wrong. Marcus was a coward, a creature of sly tricks, not open warfare. A wildfire was too unpredictable, too grand. This had to be a diversion. He would use the fire to draw every able-bodied man away from the heart of the ranch, leaving the main house and her defenseless. "Maria," she said, her voice sharp with sudden urgency, as she ran back into the house. "Bolt the back door. Bar the downstairs windows. Go to your room and lock your door. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "Child, what are you doing?" Maria cried, her face wrought with fear. "I'm keeping the fire in the hearth from going out," Isabella replied, her voice shaking but resolute. She ran to Jedediah's study, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pulled open the heavy bottom drawer of his desk. There it was, nestled in a worn leather holster, a Smith & Wesson Schofield revolver. It was smaller than Jedediah's Colt, but it felt immensely heavy in her trembling hands. The cold metallic weight was both terrifying and empowering. With a deep breath, she checked the cylinder. Fully loaded. She moved back into the vast main room, and one by one extinguished the oil lamps, plunging the house into a disorienting darkness. The only light now was the hellish, flickering glow from the distant fire, which cast long, dancing shadows through the windows. She found her place in the deep gloom beside the massive stone fireplace, its coldness seeping into her back. She raised the revolver, holding it with both hands to steady it, and pointed it toward the front of the house. And she waited. The silence that descended was more terrifying than the chaos. The distant, faint shouts of the men fighting the fire only served to emphasize the profound emptiness around her. The house groaned, the wind howled, and every sound was magnified, sending jolts of adrenaline through her. Then a new sound, sharp and deliberate, the creak of a floorboard on the front porch. A moment later, the sickening splinter of wood as the lock on the parlor window was pried open. Her breath caught in a painful knot in her throat. He was here. Marcus Thorne slipped through the open window with a slinking, predatory grace. He was a creature of the shadows, a dark silhouette against the fiery sky. In his hand, he held a lit torch, its pitch and rag head dripping molten sparks onto the fine rug. He was a pestilence come to burn the house down from within. He moved into the main room, his eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. He chuckled a low, rasping sound, full of mad glee. "A shame to burn such a fine place," he whispered to the shadows. "But if I can't have the life, no one will." From the darkness by the fireplace, a voice cut through the air, clear and cold. "Drop it, Marcus." He froze, whirling around his smug expression, melting into shock. He squinted, and his eyes widened in disbelief as he made out her form. The moonlight glinting off the long barrel of the revolver pointed directly at his heart. "Isabella," he stammered, attempting to muster his old manipulative charm. "What is this foolishness?" "Put that toy down, my dear. I've come to rescue you from this prison. You've come to burn us all alive," she retorted, her voice gaining strength. "You are a coward and a parasite. Your hold on me is broken. I said drop the torch." His face twitched, the mask of charm falling away, to reveal the raw, ugly rage beneath. "You would choose him, that cold-hearted brute who bought you like cattle over your own husband. He is more of a man in his grief than you have ever been in your life." She shot back the words, sharp as glass. "He builds things. He loves this land. You only know how to destroy. This is my home now, and you will not touch it." Seeing his power over her was utterly gone, his face contorted into a final definitive snarl of pure hatred. "Then we'll all burn together." He didn't lunge at her. He lunged toward the heavy velvet drapes hanging beside the main window. His arm raised the torch poised to set the entire house ablaze in seconds. Isabella didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She acted on pure primal instinct, the instinct to protect. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion of the gunshot was deafening, a physical blow that shook the entire room. The revolver kicked back hard, jolting her arms. Marcus screamed a high-pitched, surprised yelp and stumbled backward as if punched. He dropped the torch onto the stone hearth where it sputtered and died. He clutched his shoulder, a dark, blossoming stain, spreading rapidly across the fabric of his shirt. Just as he staggered back, his face a mask of agony and shock, the front door burst open with the force of a battering ram. Jedediah stood silhouetted in the doorway, his face blackened with soot, his eyes wide with a wild animal terror. He had seen the brief, bright flare of the torch through the window, and had ridden back like a man possessed, his heart seizing with the certainty that he was too late. He took in the scene in a fraction of a second, Thorne wounded and whimpering on the floor, the extinguished torch on the hearth, and Isabella standing her ground, defiant and trembling, the smoking Schofield still clutched in her hands. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over him. He strode forward, kicked the fallen revolver away from Thorn's reach, and looked down at the pathetic man with nothing but cold, final disgust. Then his gaze fell upon Isabella. His raw, unguarded heart was in his eyes, for her to see a maelstrom of fear, relief, and overwhelming love. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, and pulled her into his arms, enveloping her, as the tremors she had held back finally racked her body. He held her tight, his hand stroking her hair, simply breathing her in. "It's over," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with emotion and awe. "You're safe. My God, Isabella, you saved us." She had not waited for a rescuer. She had been the last bastion, the final defender of their world. In the echoing silence of the gunshot, amidst the lingering smell of gunpowder and fear, Marcus Thorne's pathetic siege had ended. And from its ashes, something new and absolutely unbreakable had been forged in the heart of Stone Crest. And so the siege of Stone Crest ended, not with a great battle, but with a single act of courage from a woman who refused to be a victim. Marcus Thorne was handed over to the law. His reign of terror finished a forgotten footnote in the history of the West. In his wake, the silence that returned to the ranch was not one of loneliness, but of profound peace. Jedediah and Isabella, bound by the fire they had faced together, rebuilt more than just fences and barns. They rebuilt a life. The house that was once a tomb of sorrow became a home filled with laughter and the scent of baking bread. The garden, her garden, became a symbol of their story, that even the most barren ground with patience and care can bring forth something beautiful. Theirs is a story that reminds us that true wealth is not in land or silver, but in the steadfast heart of another. It's a story about how the deepest wounds can be healed not by forgetting the past, but by having the courage to build a new future. If this story of redemption and unexpected love moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the heart of the Old West. Let us know in the comments what part of Jedediah and Isabella's journey touched you the most. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the trail for the next story.